Why are we where we are? The Queen's question here. Well, it was, I think it was an intellectual, an absolutely first-order intellectual failure. Again, some of the numbers are just so breathtaking. In the summer of 2007, I mean, the gearing in American investment banks was routinely 40 to 1, so for every $40 worth of assets they held or liabilities they held, they had $1 of capital. But more astonishing still, was they were refinancing a quarter of their balance sheet every day, flipping it over every night, assuming that the wholesale money markets, like the sea, were here to stay. And of course that was the real reason why Britain's demutualized building societies, like America's investment banks, got into trouble. Northern Rock, H-Boss, Bradford and Bingley, they all thought that they could securitize anything and sell it into the interbank markets, just like the American investment banks thought they could refinance a quarter of their balance sheet daily. And actually both come a cropper. There are now no American investment banks. Yeah, it's just amazing. Bear Stearns bust, Lehman's bust, Goldman Sachs is a bank, Morgan Stanley is a bank, and Merrill Lynch is actually bringing Bank of America to its knees. I mean, demutualized building societies, which some of us thought were going to be a disaster in the UK, similar story about that. Entire sector eliminated. And then over and above that, just have to acknowledge that H-Boss, which was one of Britain's top 5 banks, completely bust. Royal Bank of Scotland, completely bust. Only really both surviving, one courtesy of Lloyd's Group and the taxpayer, and the other by the UK taxpayer. £45 billion has gone in to support a bank with a balance sheet of £1.75 trillion, bigger than Britain's GDP. I just can't get over how it's almost words fail me at how catastrophic the failure is in the American and British financial systems. Even HSBC, with its rights issue of $12 billion, is actually beginning to look wobbly. Astonishing loss in AIG, America's biggest insurance company, yesterday for the fourth quarter, which together with HSBC's rights issue prompted a big seller. I mean, we are watching the disintegration of the Anglo-American financial system and potentially the European system. I was told by members of the Monetary Policy of the Bank of England yesterday that whilst the Americans and the British have begun to recognise their toxic assets, only €1 trillion of potentially €13 trillion of toxic assets are recognised in the European banking system. And then actually where the crisis goes next is France, Germany, and Eastern Europe, the Netherlands and Spain. And as Bank Santander, owns the Alliance Investor, and Abbey National, that's come straight back to us. So this is in many respects, as Alan Greenspan has said, a more acute financial crisis than that in 1929-33, with potentially as acute economic and trade effects, which is what woke me up at 4:30 in the morning and kept me awake. What can the G20 do? It's absolutely evident, as David said in his introduction, that what any country does is ineffective beside the global nature of this crisis. It's obvious to the Japanese, it's obvious to us in Britain. It's much less obvious, I must say, to the Americans. One cabinet minister I spoke to yesterday said that negotiating with the Americans eerily reminds him of actually what it was like in 1943 and 44, negotiating war loans from the Americans, and later the foundations of the Bretton Woods system. But actually the Americans do take the view that actually they can go it alone, and they will collaborate if they see an advantage, but they don't actually look to that first as actually a way of leveraging what they're doing in a way which actually will be astonishingly helpful to them. I mean, it is a plain fact that it was the world savings glut that was deposited in New York that actually was the pool of liquidity into which the banks fished and sold their securitized assets That allowed them to enter the subprime market, offering teaser interest rates, effectively zero interest rates, and to no-income households for mortgages which ran, as we now know, to trillions of dollars that actually have virtually no value. But that wouldn't have happened if they weren't absolutely at the centre of a global international financial system that they built. And indeed, it would now help them enormously for their banks if actually banks everywhere could put some kind of floor under this downward vortex that's taking place, that because the interbank markets have seized up, at the best you can do is to hold your loan book. The worst you can do is to shrink it. As you shrink your loan book, that takes property values down. You have to take more losses still. That requires recapitalization, another round of collapse of trust, and freezing of the interbank markets. And that's been the story now. Some relief in America in the interbank markets. That's one slight sign of optimism. But what would be great is if the G20 could say, with one voice, we are collectively going to take a shock-and-door approach to putting our banking systems back on their feet. We will all stand behind every depositing institution of more than, let's say, $1 billion, and we will ensure that it has Tier 1 capital, 4% of its assets, come what may. Absolute commitment by the G20 to put their public balance sheets behind the capital of their banking systems, and even, if of necessity, Tier 2 capital as well. They should all launch asset protection schemes of the type the Americans and British are developing, the Americans to support Citigroup, us to support Lloyds Group and RBS. Everybody, all central banks should commit to supply whatever liquidity is required at non-penal interest rates to get interbank markets moving. And all G20 countries should commit to creating good banks along with the de facto bad banks that they are accepting they have to do by having asset protection schemes for toxic assets.